Thanks, Rod. Okay, so as you can probably gather by the title of the presentation, there's a play on words there. But the overarching theme and the message of the presentation is that we need to drastically change our ways in training prescription. Okay? I'm going to spend the next 30 to 40 minutes convincing you that firstly it's an important fitness component and possible ways that we can look to do that. But if you don't believe my words, then hopefully you'll believe those of people better placed than myself. Sir Alex Ferguson, when talking in reference to Ronaldo, said that it's decision-making that is the most important component to consider for a player. Arsene Wenger suggested that players know what they do before they receive the ball. They have this ability to anticipate what's going to happen. Wayne Rooney, he said that in an instance you're asking yourself 5 or 6 different questions when you receive the ball. A lot of things are going through your mind. And Xavi, formerly Barcelona, now plying his trade here in Qatar, thinking quickly and looking for spaces are what he considers as important. The key elements. Some here, no, move. Some there, no, move. But he said that people don't actually realize how difficult this is. And this is where it comes into the presentation. So those are the anecdotes, but what about the evidence? What's the literature saying? Okay, Bloomfield, albeit 2007, highlighted its prevalence. So players are performing 700 plus purposeful movements, purposeful turns during the course of a game. Admittedly, this is not being developed in terms of adding to this research. The tools and methods that we use, this was a quite labor-intensive, time-consuming method, and we don't really know anything since then. Fuad highlighted its importance. Rotations and turns, along with sprinting and jumping, are the actions performed by players either assisting or scoring a goal before a goal is scored. Okay, so it's during those important stages of a game. And previously, there's evidence to suggest, albeit questionnaires, but those young players who score highly on positioning and deciding are 6 times more likely to make it to the professional level. Okay, so we can see the value in it. But I think much of the issues reside in its definition, and unfortunately they're often used interchangeably. It was Clark in 1959 that said the ability to change position or direction rapidly, change of direction. But Shelajurai in 1977 said, no, we're missing something fundamental here. We're missing that the majority of our movements are in response to a stimulus. It's that reactive element. But it also depends on who you're going to ask, depending on their expertise and their background. For example, if we were to ask a strength and conditioning coach, they may talk about the forces and the application of those forces. In terms of biomechanics, an expert may talk about the joints and the angles. And if we were to ask a motor control expert, it would be more focused on the information processing, decision and perceptual element. So we can see some discrepancies between those. So what does it look like? Okay, probably commonly seen change of direction test here, the Illinois, but you could pick a whole host of other tests, whether that's the T-test, zigzag, 505, whatever it might be. Very pre-planned, running round cones with a total time at the end. Commonplace in football, a lot of club settings. In contrast, it's not the best video I could find, but here we have the athlete. He has to respond to the tester. So this is reactive agility, and this is common within the research, looking at a human stimulus. You won't be able to see, but there's a set of timing gates either side here, and there'll be a set on the right and on the left. So essentially responding to this human stimulus here. And this is what it looks like. Okay, We're also conducting our own little bit of research in a similar regard. We're looking at this reactive agility. What we have here, the player, we have a set of timing gates, we have another set of timing gates 20 meters down the line, the opto-jump modular system, and there's 4 conditions with which the player has to respond to. If he hears no beep, then he performs maximal 20-meter sprint. Alternatively, there's a beep at 1, 1.5, or 2 seconds, randomly selected. And when the player hears that beep, they must decelerate, change direction, and reaccelerate back to the start as quickly as possible. So we're wanting to compare the movement profile for that, and what we'll do is match it up. Unfortunately, I haven't got the data at the moment, the information and video. We'll compare that to the change of direction. So we'll equal it for distance being pre-planned. And you see about now, the audio signal will go off, and he starts to perform his deceleration. You can see the technique he used with his arm coming across, and look at his final position, right in there, okay, before he starts to come out of it. Now, I hope you can take my words for it, but if we were to put a cone in there, the technique that he will use is significantly, well, it's very different. It's very different. Okay, and something to consider in terms of the signal, in terms of the stimulus that a player has to respond to. But we know that this is far from the reality of the game. And I ask the question whether we are actually governed by what is measurable, what we can measure and what we can quantify, or what is actually important. We often try to put a value, a number on something, objective data. Let's try and quantify everything. We know that science can help, but we know football isn't a science, okay? So let's demonstrate the complexities of the match. Here's an example from Manchester City. Carlos Tevez, so a few years ago, wearing a GoPro on his head, and you'll be able to see the sheer chaos that occurs during the game. So if you can make much sense of his movement and everything, then you're doing well. There's a particular moment where he has 3 defenders around him that I find particularly impressive. Here. 1, 2, 3, manages to get out of it. Yet we test the players and we think that that applies to this particular scenario. So essentially, it's much more complex than that. We can see the complexity. So the components. Agility as a whole is often focused on the physical aspect, this change of direction speed. This was developed in 2002 by Young, looking at technique, straight sprinting speed, leg muscle qualities, and of that, strength, reactive strength, and power, etc. The suggestions that this is an oversimplification of it, and that more recently there's core strength being added, people suggesting rate of force development is also important, but essentially it doesn't offer everything. And it's this aspect, this perceptual and decision-making factors where we need to place greater attention, particularly in terms of the visual scanning, anticipation, pattern recognition, and knowledge of situation. And this is where our downfall is that we often neglect this area and we tend to focus purely on the physical aspect. Yet it seems to be this is the most important. And how to demonstrate that? A few studies have looked to compare change of direction versus agility, okay? And looking at the relationship between the two. But it seems to be that they are separate, discrete qualities. They're independent of each other. So one doesn't transfer to the next. The relationship between the two, the common variance, is low. Now, if we take that a step further and look solely at reactive agility, we have different ways of measuring it, different ways of testing. A light stimulus, 2-dimensional stimulus, okay, so a video projector tends to be performed in the laboratory, or, as we saw before, human stimulus. Okay? And there's evidence to suggest often that differences in their ability to discriminate between playing standards. This light stimulus, usually available with commercial timing gates, does not allow experts to demonstrate their greater levels of skill, because essentially it's information processing. You see the light being on or off, and you react to that. Whereas here, the two-dimensional and three-dimensional is where experts can use their cognitive ability of anticipating. And these are where the differences lie. In another instance, nice paper by Lee, looking at differences between tests. So in that first example, just a change of direction test, the participant, football players, already know the arrow direction, so they move in that position. In another instance, it was reactive agility, and the arrow came up just before that change of direction. There was also reactive agility to a projector screen with one opponent on the screen, and in another instance, two opponents. So the vision is taken away, they have to focus on one player, but obviously this other player is causing a few problems with what they're focusing on. So the players here had to change direction in the opposite way. Okay, so if they approach, turn that way, they're going in the opposite. And what's been found? Well, different biomechanical profiles are evident dependent on the stimulus, depending on the visual stimulus. So essentially, they're not interchangeable. Okay, that's important to remember. Let's think of starting to drive, starting to learn how to drive. You're in a car park, empty car park with a few cones dotted around. Navigate yourself around those cones. Okay. You're now ready to go onto the streets of Doha or into Formula One. Not the case, is it? Okay? Totally different. And therefore, we're not preparing or protecting our players for the rigors of competitive match play. And we need to do better in order to achieve that. Small but mighty is the message here. You may think, well, it's only a small aspect of total agility time. The ability to respond, that decision making. And yes, it only counts for 3% of the total time to complete a reactive agility test. Compare that to the movement time, the actual physical aspect, which accounts for 70, possibly 80%. Yet, despite that being the case, the relationship between decision-making time and total time to complete an agility test is stronger than what it is for movement time and total time to complete the agility test. So although it's small, it has a greater influence, a greater input. And again, we can see that when we're looking at the differences between high and low level performers. Differences have been seen between rugby players, rugby union, rugby league, AFL, soccer, netball, hockey, using three-dimensional stimulus. And a lot of the studies have previously focused on total time, yet there's been greater emphasis more recently, obviously, on the decision-making time, using high-speed cameras. Importantly, decision accuracy. It's all good and well being faster, but if we're not making the appropriate and accurate decisions, then it might be redundant, it might be futile. And there's also some studies looking at this confidence rating, so how confident the player was at performing the most appropriate response. So what are the factors that we need to consider? Well, there's limited evidence, there's limited research, admittedly. Aspetar suggests that better performance or faster change of direction, greater muscle activity for those who perform it faster. Moni, apologies for my French accent, but showed that lateral trunk flexion differs between planned and unplanned, so the change of direction and the reactive agility. And I'll come back into that more later from an injury perspective, But those differences increased dependent on the time frame available. The suggestions that experts have this better ability to read the fixation points on an opponent, what they look at, and the duration is different to those non-experts, picking up those stimuli, picking up those cues to respond to. And non-experts just don't have that ability. And possibilities of greater regional brain activity. So there's things being thrown about, but we've still not put anything on the money. We've still not pinpointed it. So mind the pun, but here's a bit of an example of what that looks like. So Cristiano Ronaldo, okay, admittedly for the purposes, might be glorified for the purposes of a television program, but we have 3 different instances here. So the ball is crossed in from a teammate and the light is switched off in midair. And as you can see, successful in the first goal with a diving header. Impressively, I think here, he's able to anticipate and be able to read whereabouts that ball is going. He comes forward. It bounces just in front. Still executes a very nice technique. Okay. But most impressively for me is the final clip. The lights are turned off before the ball is even kicked. It might not be his greatest finish, but it might be actually him showing, look, I can do this very easily. The lights have gone off. There we see, slow motion, lights have gone off. He adjusts himself, he can read, comes in. Very nice finish. So what are the factors that we might be looking at? Well, some studies have tried to look at relationships between reactive agility and other performance measures. The Stroop test, FMS, functional movement screening. We're looking at limited kind of relationships. And this is a really interesting one for us, I think, as practitioners. And this relationship between reactive agility and particularly strength. So in this instance, eccentric strength, and we can see when change of direction, the relationship with eccentric strength is much greater than what it is for reactive agility, non-existent. And it's the same message in these other 2 studies, that change in direction has that nice little relationship more often than not with strength. And this is ranging from concentric, eccentric, isometric, relative strength, power. So a whole host of different strength and power measures. But it's just non-existent when the relationship comes to agility. So essentially that cognitive demand, that cognitive load is causing a problem. It's maybe diminishing our ability to use that strength that we've maybe been acquiring in the gym. That seems to be further reduced with a second stimulus. Now, if we can imagine the game is constantly responding to the opponent, the movement of the ball, it's not just one stimulus like we do in testing. Constantly evolving and many decisions, as Rooney said. Sorry about that, I don't know why. So what are we doing? Seems as though we're tending to focus on this easy way. We're looking at very simple change of direction. At most, we're looking at very basic temporal and spatial. Maybe responding to a red cone. I put the red cone up, you have to run to the red cone. I put the yellow cone up, you have to run to the yellow. That's far from the universal complexities of match play, as we've mentioned. Nice little study by Young and Rogers compared change of direction training to small-sided games on reactive agility, change of direction speed, and sprinting. As you can see there by the results, total time improved through a small-sided games, but nicely through the decision-making. So they had this increased ability to improve their decision-making from this small-sided game training. Now, I think this has particular implications for the return to play, from the injury to the performance. And that is, if you can see the number of change of direction maneuvers, it's much greater than that of the small-sided games. That small-sided games offers a more potent training effect because it has that cognitive demand in as well. Now, admittedly, we need to be looking more into this kind of research. This is just the basics. This is the start. But the message here is the compatibility between the stimulus and the response. And that's often where our downfall is. We need to be looking at making sure that what we're providing as a stimulus is compatible to the appropriate response for those sports and possibly for those positions and individuals. There's not been much research performed on training interventions as a whole. We've just mentioned there the small-sided games. There's some evidence, video perceptual training. None in terms of modifying technique and strength training. Yet obviously there's a lot of strength training intervention in relation to change of direction speed. This is the big question that we're asking ourselves, the transfer to match performance. And unfortunately, there's only been a limited amount from the video and perceptual training. That can be illustrated, I think, particularly nice little study by Tim Gabbett. Although it might lack the scientific rigor that we often try to advocate with research, I think the concept and the idea was very nice. As the title says, does improved decision-making ability reduce the physiological demands of game-based activities in field sport athletes? I think this was in female soccer players, relatively short intervention. It was shown that cognitive function through some video tests improved. As we kind of expect in terms of physical performance measures, no improvement for speed, repeated speed, I think endurance. Cognitive function when it comes to decision-making on the field. So they had some experts analyze and saying, okay, the accuracy of the pass or the dribble, the decision-making, supposedly increased, improved, but there was no change in terms of the activity profiles within the match. No GPS or Prozone or performance or any equipment like that was used. It was pretty much hand notation, just looking at time. So I think that's a particular flaw. But I think the concept itself is nice. We're always trying to push the physical limits of these players. Can we just take a different approach and say we need to improve their cognitive function? We need to make them a bit better in terms of their decision making. Let's make them smarter as opposed to always trying to make them harder, fitter, better in that sense. In terms of other studies along the same lines, we can see that there is some support, but it's not all the time. Okay, and I think we still need to look at this area in a lot more detail. Essentially that transfer to match performance, but also, as I got there, the retention of it. Possibly certain players are able to retain those skills and those qualities better. What's the consequence to an off-season period or to injury? All these questions we need to answer. So kind of as a bit of a summary then, change of direction and agility, they're independent skills. And the importance of the physical qualities is greater for the change of direction than for agility. We need to appreciate that stimulus and response. I'm going to move on to the injury aspect now. And where I'd like to start with that is, as you probably know, the increase in the demands of competitive match play here in the Premier League from 2006 to 2013. As you can see, quite some substantial increases, 80% number of sprints, 12% number of passes, 50% number of actions. But let's not just think about the physical consequence of these demands, these increased demands. What about the cognitive? Because essentially, albeit 10 years old now, I think this nicely illustrates the differences in injury rates between match play and training. The triangles here being the matches, and the circles here being the training. With the exception of the Kirkendall study, we can clearly see there's a big difference between the two. So there's something about the match that is causing us a problem. So coming back to what we just said there, and these are some hypothetical examples. If there's an increase in the number of passes, it's possible that our attention is constantly shifting. So if I'm a defender, okay, the opponent has the ball here, he's moved the pass again. I'm constantly shifting my attention. The level of skill. We're up against the Ronaldos and the Messis of the world now. Greater number of deceptions and feints that we have to put up against. An increased running speed may equate to reduced decision response time. Increased actions, maybe change direction, accelerations, decelerations. We're exposing ourselves to a greater variation of turns and turn angles. As we mentioned right at the start, if there's an increase in goals, then maybe the players are performing these rotations and these turns more often. And overall demands and pressures of the game have increased. So maybe that's equating to, as a lot of research is trying to look at, the fatigue. Now let's try and match that up with the literature. Well, shift of attention. Several studies have suggested through video analysis that it's this deviation, shifting our attention, that's often coinciding with injuries. The attention is taken away. They're focusing on the ball or the opponent. Okay? Less time available. Possible injury risk. Task achievement. This trade-off between speed and accuracy. We want to accomplish something fast, but do we have the control? Do we have the accuracy and the ability to do that? Torso lean and rotation suggested to be a possible injury risk factor. Modified technique. Okay, if we induce that level of fatigue, whether it's short-term, long-term, biomechanical profiles like to be modified. So Dempsey illustrated some causes for concern in terms of technique. Wide foot placement, torso rotation, and this lateral trunk flexion, so that torso lean. So areas to think about, but we cannot avoid those movements. It's very difficult to do so. Just coming back to this study we mentioned previously, lateral trunk flexion, and looking at anticipated versus unanticipated, okay, and this is time frames before the contact of the foot on the forced platform, and we can see trunk rotation and particularly lateral trunk flexion, differences between the anticipated and unanticipated, but these differences, importantly, become even greater within the reactive element. So it's not just whether it's planned and unplanned, it's the time frame available. Now, if we don't have that ability to anticipate and we're always responding, we're leaving ourselves a short time frame, it's possible that we're always putting ourselves in danger. So who's at risk? Well, it's the common thought that our better players are able to dodge those tackles, get away from those instances. Might not necessarily be the case. That instance where it doesn't happen in practice, but it happens when you present. Yeah, in terms of who's at risk, we often think that those better players are able to get out of those positions. Well, again, the research is limited, but from what we can take from Roald Barr's group, looking at young female soccer players, those high level, considered high level by the coach in terms of scoring, showed a greater likelihood of injuries, and particularly for decision making when defending and attacking, whether with or without the ball. And Tim Gabbett looked at the relationship with reactive agility. And those who are faster, those who are better on reactive agility, are more likelihood to becoming injured. So they controlled for the playing time. So obviously those higher level performers will be getting more playing time. But there's also more research in this area that is needed. That brings us on nicely to a recent review by Walden, looking at injury mechanisms, suggested that 85% of injuries are non-contact. Interestingly, 77% of these were whilst defending. This corresponds nicely with physical requirements seemingly increasing for defenders. The demands have increased. And he illustrated within the paper three particular points, three particular mechanisms that are cause for concern. And that is non-contact pressing, non-contact kicking, and non-contact heading. Now, it might just be coincidence, but my interpretation of this was there's three kind of signals, three kind of messages that I was seeing is that there's always a player in close proximity. Okay, it might not be contact, but there's a player in close proximity. If we're looking at similar research, Renama, looking at moments of injury risk, suggesting that the first 15, the last 15 minutes of the game were the greatest concern, possibly because we're trying to make an impression on our opposition. Contesting play, and contesting play within particularly dangerous areas, so close to the goal, or those kind of areas that are sort of highly stressful. And another study showed similar kind of values to Walden. 73% of injuries occur during defending. ACL injuries occur during defending. But importantly, and I think it comes back to what we've just shown, is that 82% of non-contact injuries occurred with an opposing player within close proximity, within 1 or 2 meters of that individual. So we might view it and say it's non-contact, but there is still an influence from an external, there's still an influence from an opposing player. So we need to understand the context of what we're looking at. To provide a bit of a theoretical model or concept behind this, some nice work on ecological dynamics, and it's derived from the psychology side. But essentially, adaptive behavior, actions, decisions, perceptions, is a function between the person and his or her environment interaction. Perception and action coupling. In those words of Gibson, we must perceive in order to move. So what we do, how we do it, is often dependent on what we see. This links nicely into this dyadic systems. Okay, and if we think about football, it is composed of many dyadic systems. And what that is symmetry between a player and an opponent. Stabilizing and destabilizing this symmetry. So me as a defender, I want to maintain that stability, whereas an attacker is trying to destabilize. They're trying to get away from me. They're trying to reposition themselves, get away and score a goal. I need to maintain that symmetry, to maintain that stability between the two of us. So that links nicely into what we've just seen in terms of stats for defenders possibly, because essentially it's a game of cat and mouse. So rather than always just describing, as a lot of the epidemiological studies are doing, rather than just describing, we also need to explain the context, the whys and the hows of these injuries. So as I mentioned, it's a game of cat and mouse, but so as a result, let's think of a prime example. Maybe we could show Rooney versus Terry. We could show maybe Messi versus Ramos, or we can show the original, Tom versus Jerry. So the Tomcat is always trying to get close to the striker. But unfortunately, as we probably always know, he gets in those difficult positions and he finds himself at the end of those injuries. Because Jerry almost always pre-planned, knows what he's going to do, and he's always in trouble. And just when he thinks he's got him where he wants him, an opposing player or a teammate distracts him, his visual stimulus, okay, and he's in trouble again. So what's been done to date? Well, there's a lot of focus on this multi-component prevention programs. We try and make them stronger so they're more resistant. We try and improve their aerobic aspects so they can be less fatigued. We try and make them more supple so they can get out of those positions. It's pretty much a blanket approach. We need to have a bit more focus in what we're looking at. And a recent review by Papas suggesting that we have the potential to improve cutting task biomechanics, especially when they emphasize individualized biomechanical technique correction. This is the extent that we need to go to. The particular study that I would highlight from here, although there was only 7 that met the inclusion criteria, one of the most effective was that of Dempsey, and albeit one of the shortest interventions of 6 weeks, only 2 times a week, 15 minutes, they showed some of the greatest changes, greatest improvements in task biomechanics. And I think that's partially down, or arguably a lot down, to what they did. And that was progressive from closed skills, finishing in open skills towards the end of those 6 weeks. Also providing individualized feedback through video analysis. So what's the possible directions we need to consider as well? Well, nice review in sports medicine by Brown suggested that we need to look at unplanned sports tasks in the development of ACL injury screening. Likewise, again in sports medicine, so both pretty recent, reaction to and decision making in unexpected situations is an area that we need to be moving towards when it comes to training prescription. It comes with this concept of organized chaos. As I said before, we always try to have so much control and so much in terms of limitations when it just does not replicate that of the game. There is this element of chaos. Now, if we can have some understanding of that through the demands of the game, yes, we're far from understanding, but we need to be moving towards that. And thinking about how they marry up. So there's a lot of focus on these aspects, and in particular the return to play. So if you just mentioned, if it comes to injury prevention, or if it comes to injury and return to play, for example, do we just return them to pre-injury values for a change of direction test? Is that enough? Do we need to supersede that? Do we need to go further? There's obviously a cause, there was an issue in the first place. So we need to take that step further. We think about the change of direction versus small-sided games intervention, the study by Young and Rogers. And then what we do with change of direction, although it might give us more agility maneuvers, might not be ticking the boxes. So it comes to this continuum in that let's avoid those simple decision responses. Let's look towards those more complex decisions. Okay, and let's think about also not just these basic skills training of running around cones, etc., but worst case scenarios. Let's not just think about averages, but worst case scenarios as well. So the take-home messages would be, we need to understand the overall demands, of the game. Positional if possible, and even individual. Different players for the same position will execute and move and perform actions in different manners. They're distinct, separate qualities, and we need to think about that a lot more. We need to be moving away, drastic changes, moving away from this change of direction and moving towards this reactive agility. Avoid a reductionist approach when it comes to training. Think about the complexity of what we're doing. Rather than just simple decision responses, we need to shift towards complex decision making and the compatibility between the stimulus that we provide and the response to that. And the differences between performance enhancement and injury prevention. One doesn't always equate to the other. We need to be focusing on what we're looking to improve in those separate, and hopefully towards the end it comes together. So I'd just like to leave you with the words of Andre Gide, and that is, one doesn't discover new lands without consenting to lose sight of the shore for a very long time. Admittedly, this area of reactive agility is very complex, given the fact that we have this cognitive task, this cognitive demand. Yet, we need to be exploring, we need to be moving further forward. And yes, we might take a few wrong turns, and we might actually get to that other side and think, well, it's not all it's cracked up to be. But we at least need to endeavour to move forward in that area. Thank you.